Hello, everybody. Welcome to the most recent episode of Policy War. I am Russell. I'm one of your hosts, and I am the progressive on this debate/discussion podcast. I'll let.
I am Matthew. I'm center of the road. Well, at least I perceive myself that way with a libertarian slant. I like to see myself as the middle ground.
And I am John. I represent the conservative perspective on this podcast.
And today we're going to be talking about a lot of different perspectives through the PRO Act. The PRO Act means the protecting the right to organize, and it is a piece of legislation that was just passed in the House in early March and has to do with government support for unions. Now, this is pretty historic since the last pro-government union act was Wagner Act back in 1935. So it's been a little while since the federal government has passed any pro-union legislation. Unions have been declining in membership since the 1970s, and they've definitely got less power. And for those who aren't that experienced with unions, basically what unions do is protect workers from getting fired in a multitude of ways. They usually increase the average wage of the person inside the union. They can threaten to strike if they don't get certain benefits that they want, say healthcare or workers' compensation, say getting injured. The union can secure more benefits than a person can secure individually because they have that collective power. They have the ability to threaten to strike. So the PRO Act is meant to increase union power and kind of reverse the trend that has been going for some decades now. And Democrats are trying to get it through during Biden's honeymoon phase when he can actually have a higher chance of changing things. So for more specifically, for what the bill does, it reduces the power of companies to basically declare their employees as independent contractors. Uber and Lyft do this. And the main reason they do is so their workers cannot unionize and demand more benefits. Is also so Uber doesn't have to give certain benefits to employees that were fired, such as severance pay or things like that. It really gives unions more power to strike and negotiate, because previously union striking was illegal. It was just not really enforced by the government. Usually they work out a negotiation, but union striking was illegal and is now in many cases, unless, like, for example, if you have a no strike clause in your contract, the union can't strike, but obviously some unions will anyway. So that's an example. It has to be clearly stated in the contract if you can or not. It also makes it so the National Relations Labor Board can actually fine businesses. And this is something it cannot do before. The Labor Board is basically something that was created with the Wagner Act, and it was made to basically let the government actually punish businesses more for violating some of the union contracts, because businesses often would ignore the contracts if they saw the profit margins were more than the negatives forced, and they often were. So you'd see many employees getting fired anyway, not caring about what the union contract said. It was just a balancing act for them if the union would strike or not. So this bill does a lot. It definitely shows clear government support of the unions and balances the relationship more to the union's favor instead of the pro-business side. And it has a lot of implications, especially during COVID. So I want to first hear John's view on this.
Fundamentally, I think my position reflects the positions of many conservatives. And I think there are many people who think like me who would say that unions are not in and of themselves a bad thing. Being able to collectively bargain and negotiate as a group with a particular company is not somehow horribly anti-business. That being said, unions are similarly not categorically a good thing. And I think this is becoming more and more true as we've seen the decline of unions, because fundamentally the government has taken on more of the responsibility that the unions used to take unto themselves through things like OSHA and the National Labor Relations Board. Now, with this particular bill in question, I have three problems with it that are most pressing to my mind. First and foremost, I do not like the fact that it essentially invalidates all state right to work laws. These are laws that are active in 27 states, I believe, in which case a particular firm in which employees at that firm are represented by a union, that union cannot force new employees to join that union or pay dues. That employee can come and join that particular firm, and they cannot be forced to join the union. I believe that that is an important protection of liberty. and that protects people who may not want to participate in any particular union and yet are able to come to an agreement with the particular company to work there. I think that this is an overreach of federal power, and I don't believe that it should be validated. Second, I do not like the fact that within the PRO Act, there is a provision that would offer arbitration to deals between a company and a new union. Oftentimes, this is where unions tend to die because they cannot come to an appropriate contract with the company against which they're trying to unionize. However, this bill would offer arbitration for those particular negotiation impasses. And I believe that in many cases, arbitration, especially when it is done through the government, can be very damaging, as controversies ought to be considered between the parties themselves unless there is some sort of violation of law, in which case we can bring in the judicial system. Otherwise, arbitration ought to be a mutual agreement, not something forced upon one side by the other. My third problem with this is that it gives extra teeth to the National Labor Relations Board. And here's the problem. I think any reasonable person would agree that fundamentally that board exists to advocate for employees more than it does employers. And by the aggregate effects of this particular bill, I believe that this shifts the balance of power firmly into the union's favor. I believe that in enforcing employment law, there should not be the deck stacked against either side. And so fundamentally, I believe when controversies are brought between two parties, that the law should be enforced fundamentally rather than one side being consistently at a disadvantage, which I believe the passing of this act would do. Fundamentally, both employers and employees have rights. They take on certain amounts of risk. They take on certain amounts of benefit from their relationship. I believe that employers and employees ought to be free to define those relationships without overt and overreaching government interference.
Okay, Matthew, what do you think about this?
I may not be the most knowledgeable on it. I see some, of course, positive things to the bill, being able to have people collectively meet without the employers calling meetings to disrupt unions, because if you're going to be able to unionize, you shouldn't have the employers be able to call off meetings, especially if a majority want to meet, because that kind of disrupts the whole reason of it. Contrary to John's opinion, I think that being able to start unions, especially in this day and age, with the first negotiation kind of being arbitrated with the government, if the employer and the union cannot reach an agreement, is perhaps a good start, as we can see with companies that are as big as Amazon trying to hush unions, and you finally have these workers coming forth. And Amazon, with its size, I'm willing to bet you has no problem whatsoever being able to provide those benefits. If it came down to it, I doubt that they would be hurting in any way. And I think that if it were to come to a dispute, you'd be able to get like a bipartisan group to come to an agreement. I doubt that if you're to have an arbitration by the government, that it would be, someone who's all pro-union. I would at least hope that there'd be some sort of middle ground, maybe a group of a mix of people, maybe some involved in business, some on the union side, and neutral parties who have nothing to do with it that would be arbitrating disputes anyway. So I think it's a good step in that regard. I also, I'm kind of wishy-washy about the idea of secondary strikes being allowed, because in a way I can see where it's beneficial, and I can also see how it's kind of, I guess I don't know the line between what's considered a secondary strike. Because for those who don't know, a secondary strike, from my understanding, is when you go on strike against another business because they're doing business with the business that you are currently against one of their practices for. For example, if you did not like Walmart's policies and there is a restaurant, we'll say, that purchases meat from Walmart, you could strike at the restaurant because they're purchasing meat and you don't agree with Walmart's policies. I can see where that'd be a problem for smaller businesses that may rely on supply chains where they can't readily switch supply chains. But in another sense, it's like, how would you even gauge something like that? What stops a consumer from saying, I just don't support that business. I'm just not going to pay for their stuff. I'm just, not going to give them business. I don't support them. I call for a boycott. I guess I just don't see the thing in that. Maybe I'm not as nuanced when it comes to it, but I can see some good and bad from it. I guess the final talking point I'd like to cover is the thing about unions giving benefits and the Uber and Lyft situation. So I can kind of see what John's saying about the right to work, where you shouldn't have to join a union if you don't want to join a union. But I think Russ would make a counter argument that I can sympathize with the fact that these workers that go to work usually get some of the benefits that these unions give them. So since you can't really have discrimination, at least to my knowledge, to say, okay, you're not a union member, therefore you don't get these things, but we're going to sign a contract with you where the benefits you get in the contract were gained because of these unions. How do you rectify that? I mean, if there was maybe a third party type thing where it's like, okay, you're non-unionized worker, but you don't get the benefits the unionized workers get. Okay, something like that I could see as fair. And this will kind of lead into the idea behind, will this drive a divide between freelance and like part-time workers and those that are full-time? Bringing up Uber and Lyft, you see the gig economy coming up where people can do a job for 2 or 3 hours because they have free time and they want to make a buck or two. And there's nothing wrong with that. But where do we draw the line with people who are going to be full-time with those jobs? And if we make it to where they have to provide benefits, will that turn away those who are doing part-time? Because essentially anyone can opt in and out of these jobs. There's nothing stating they have to work a certain amount of hours. To my knowledge, you're just flipping the switch, saying you're available and doing these drives. So I guess there's a little bit of clarification, some things I don't really understand, but I see some costs and benefits to it.
I mean, interesting analysis by both of you. I mean, unions are really an organization that is the voice of the workers, in my opinion, is the collective force of the working class in the most clear way possible. I mean, if you're arguing for the balance of power, it's kind of between workers' rights and employer rights. It depends which one that you value more as an individual. I think for me, it's obvious I value workers' rights, not to the point where workers should say control a share of the company's profits through stocks, but to the point that they should have wage that is sustainable and livable. So I do want to go through some of the points I've heard. First, on the problem that the bill violates the state right to work laws on states. The reason the bill basically overturns that is so there's no favoritism, because what we see here is that many companies would move from the north to the south with weaker union laws just for profits. It makes it so that certain states are favorited over others because they're less pro-worker. And it disincentivizes states to really care about workers' rights when you have to balance that with businesses coming to your area for economic development. So I think the federal government actually taking control of this process makes it so no state is disadvantaged for actually making a stand and improving workers' lives. They shouldn't be punished for that. And it really should be a federal initiative. I mean, the second point that John brought up, the arbitration that the government allows is a bad thing. And I didn't like the rhetoric that was thrown around there. You act like the government's forcing the arbitration when really they're just making a clearer way for them to negotiate contracts and make it so can't delay it for years and years, which is what they always do. And because they delay it so long, union leaders can't really get those protections of or not getting fired because they're part of a union. They can't get the benefits of the fees paid by the workers, and they lose morality because everything stops a union from being formed because they don't want workers' rights. They don't want workers' rights at all. They don't want strikes. They want to pay their workers as little as humanly possible and make money. That's capitalism. For your third point, it gives extra teeth to the National Relations Board. I mean, oh my God, workers have more power. Government, it's a horrible thing. That's what I'm hearing right now. The National Relations Board was literally made to give workers more power. So the fact that it can actually fine companies when companies don't follow the contracts, I think that's a reasonable thing to do because it's done in every civil contract. You had to face a punishment for not following the contract. The fact that the government doesn't even enforce it and can just investigate it is pointless to me. And offers no real teeth to the board. It's actually giving the board some actual power, which I guess capitalists wouldn't like that much. The only point I want to make here is really the point of income inequality that unions solve. If we look at the average rate of income union workers make compared to non-union workers, they make about 13% more, which is huge. Because if we look at wage stagnation in America, which is horrid, it's some of the worst of any country. The Economic Policy Institute reported that CEO compensation, people that conservatives seem to love so much, their wages have grown 940% since 1978, while typical worker compensation has risen only 12% during that time, 1978. Let me do a little bit of math in my head. It's about 40 plus years. And wage stagnation has existed for workers, but not for the CEOs. I wonder why. It's because they're making so much profit. All the profit is going to them. Trickle down economics don't work. All these people do is hoard all the wealth to make more wealth. They don't pay their workers even though they have the ability to. That's why things like Fight for 15, which was mainly organized by union workers to get McDonald's and Amazon, two of some of the richest companies in the world who will not even pay their workers $15 an hour, shows why we need unions. We need unions to decrease income inequality and make sure that 1% of the population doesn't just hoard all the wealth when they have more than enough to give to the workers who need it and who can barely buy food at the end of the day. Do you think this trend is something America should have done years ago, or do you think the National Labor Relations Labor Board should even exist in the first place? I mean, either of you can answer that question.
So I certainly think the National Labor Relations Board should exist. I think that having things like OSHA and the extensive workers' rights legislation we have at the federal and state level, that's a good thing. And that's largely a product of the progressive era. I mean, when unions first came around, the conditions under which workers worked were absolutely abysmal. And so we have progressively over time, we have been able to improve the conditions of workers. And we've been able to pass both laws and regulations at multiple levels in order to ensure that their rights are protected. And I think it is because of those regulations and those laws that unions have become less and less valuable, because frankly, you no longer need the union to make sure that people's arms aren't actively getting cut off in the middle of a factory, because we already have extensive regulations regarding that. We already have labor laws to ensure that companies are at least doing a certain bare minimum. And I think that's the appropriate standard for the government to set, is the bare minimum, not the gold standard. Furthermore, as I said in the beginning, I don't think that unions are necessarily a bad thing. I just don't think unions having more power is an end unto itself. I think that the more you empower unions, good unions will function very well and do good things to their workers. Bad unions won't. And that is also why I'm so in support of the right to work laws, because if you have a union at a particular shop and it's a obnoxiously bad union where you're paying, say, $50 a month to be in it and you're accruing $5 a month of benefit, wow, that's not a union I want to be a part of. And you mentioned something that it's actually one of the best counter arguments to right to work. People who can accrue benefits that the union negotiated despite the fact they're not in the union. I fully understand that. And that's why I don't think that workers who are not a member of the union should be legally mandated to receive all of the benefits that were negotiated by the particular union. This will increase, if the unions are doing well and negotiating well for the employees that they represent, then this will increase the value of that union. And the more people that enter into that union are then going to increase the union's power. I think that is a much more organic way to ensure the power of unions to be able to organize than forcing people who don't want to join unions into it, and thus giving a significantly lower incentive for unions to actually be effective, because that just means that everyone has to join. If I make cars and everyone has to buy my car if they want to live in this town, well, what's my incentive to make good cars? You have to buy it. And so I think that's a much more organic way to make unions more valuable. And while I agree with the extensive workers' rights legislation we have, I disagree with this idea that we need to place more of a noose around employers. As you said, you care more about employee rights than employer rights. I tend to think of myself as appreciating both. And so I don't think we should necessarily be intentionally stacking the deck towards one.
One of the questions I would like to ask, because it looks like we're kind of we've got a dispute on the right to work and the balance there, but we haven't really touched base on some of the other things I think we could possibly come to agreement on, like secondary strikes and the prevention of replacing workers that are striking, because that's another thing outlined in the bill. If you're striking, you can't be replaced permanently. They can hire people temporarily, but they can't get rid of your spot. On top of that, just the idea that you can't call anti-union meetings or require it to continue on the workforce. So what's some of your guys' opinion on those?
I mean, for secondary strikes, I mean, I think it's to the union's own ability and freedom to be able to do that. They should be able to strike on related corporations along with their own corporation to show solidarity between the movements. Restricting that would just restrict unified union power. And I'm not trying to say union too much, but it would do that. For the point on you can't fire your employees when they're striking is a huge point, because Boeing made this controversial move of firing all their employees when they're doing a massive protest and moving to another state. And really, any company, sadly, is able to do that. Reagan actually popularized the action when he was governor of California and fired all the air traffic controllers that were protesting at the time and just hired new ones. And that's when the practice became popular for companies to just fire their workers and hire new ones. It ruins the whole point of strike. It also is bad for the company because they destroy their reputation, showing they really don't care about you at all. And also they get lower quality workers most of the time. So instead of going for deliberation, they just say, we're just gonna cut the tree off by the head and just get out of here. Now, for anti-union meetings, Amazon is the icon of this. They have on their warehouses, they have anti-union propaganda. They often will do everything in their power to make sure unions aren't formed, because there's this thing called the monopsony power, monopsony power, which basically means when a company is the only one in its industry and there's no competition or very little competition, that company can decide the wages of all the workers in that industry. And Amazon's in that particular position. There's very little online e-commerce industries that can deliver on the rate or scale Amazon can. Therefore, Amazon is a monopoly in that specific industry. Walmart's trying to challenge them, but they're not even close. And they can decide the wages of everybody in that industry, which means if the workers create a union here, they have a union over most of the industry. It's why it's so important, and it's why Amazon's so powerful. Like, there's nowhere else you want to go if you want to, say, deliver packages of $17, $18 an hour. Amazon's one of the best payers at that. But it could be even better if there is a firm union established. So, in summary, I believe the balance of power is already in the employer's hands. They have all the money. They decide the contract for each individual employee, and they can get up and move whenever they want to. I think really the balance of power really needs to be shifted, and the only way for that really to be done is by the government stepping in. It's really democracy in its purest form, by letting the people organize, hold democratic elections for union leaders, and demand more economic rights. It's really the main way workers have improved their livelihood in America and almost any other country in the world. So I don't think we should inhibit that. I think we should encourage more of that. Matthew, I want to hear, what do you think about the general prospect of union growth? While we may have some disagreements with some of the peculiarities, what do you think about unions as a whole?
I believe they have their place, especially in the trades, and they shouldn't be thrown out. By all means, I don't believe we've reached a point where you can say, okay, we've got labor equality, there'll never be a point for a union. You know, we've got enough stuff there, because I believe you're going to have these companies, like you said, like Amazon. They're in a situation where they can offer jobs and they can give these jobs, but they can quash unionization. And you can always, of course, make the argument that these individuals aren't, held hostage at these jobs. They can quit. They have freedom to choose other jobs or pursue other things, by all means. But you can also kind of make the argument of, maybe the workplace is not the most optimal. And maybe that's not accounted for within the wages. And since so many people are willing to take that job, you'll have a decent turnover of it. And there's just not a sticking point to it. And there may be people that don't have the upward mobility to go to other jobs, especially when you've got these large, basically unskilled jobs that pay a decent wage nowadays. So I can see both ends to it, especially where, I think of myself as a college student. I don't consider that career. I mean, that's a stepping point. So there needs to be kind of like the minimum wage argument. There needs to be that stepping stone where it's like, this is not supposed to be full time. I'm not supposed to have full health benefits on this. They extended the age for the Affordable Care Act for, dependents to 26. So it's like, maybe there needs to be discrimination in that sense. You know what I mean? I don't need to have healthcare. I don't need to have those primary things because during my time, I'm just working to have spending money. But there needs to be something there for those that don't have that opportunity. So it's drawing that line without screwing people over. Because I can see with John, where that apply with small firms. If they don't have the power to quash something like that, I could see them shaking in their boots about some federal government, employee or, this board of people from the federal government telling them, oh, well, here's what we've deemed that you have to pay the workers and what we think you can do. Yeah, I agree. With these big companies like Walmart, Target, Amazon, you could do that to them. GM, GE, you could tell them, here's what we want you to do. But for those smaller ones, I could see where it's a problem. You could possibly have these firms saying, we don't feel comfortable hiring more people. And so that could possibly stop their expansion, and it can have other ramifications. So I guess it just depends on the scale of it and to what degree it's implemented, and as long as it's not partisan along the way, because I still see some serious things that need to be addressed.
So I'm going to start real quick on a couple of points that I think we can actually agree on. So I agree, things like companies calling anti-union mandatory meetings. I think that actively anti-union behavior like that, I don't believe that should be legal in the same way that you can't make a hiring decision based on the fact of whether or not you think someone will join the union. That being said, I certainly think that companies who engage in improving the workplace as sort of a disincentive to form the union, so they make the conditions of the workplace better and better in order to make people less motivated to join one, I think that's perfectly fine. I think that achieves the same end. Where I kind of back away is things like the prohibition on permanently replacing workers. In my perfect conservative world, I would say that unless it's clearly spelled out in a contract, I think unions should have an absolute right to strike, but the company should have the absolute right to enforce consequences from that. If you sign a contract saying that you will do a certain amount of work with a company for a certain amount of compensation, which is a mutually agreed upon contract, then if you then break that contract for whatever reason, whether it's you want better conditions or you simply don't want to be there, then I think the company has an absolute right to replace you. So I like to think of that policy as more freedom oriented than anything else. The foundation of most of my beliefs is I think that people ought to be free to engage in economic commerce as they so choose, subject to what regulations we permit in the mixed market. Fundamentally, I don't think companies should be going after trying to be democracies, because there's not the coercion that you in the United States. We're a democracy. You can't choose to not to be part of the democracy unless you move to a different country. So long as you're within our jurisdiction, you are under our laws. And so that needs to be a representative system. But in companies, yes, the employer holds great amount of power because they hold the greatest amount of risk. So they put their money, their capital up in order to have this company function. And then the company functions along with labor, which is, if you look at it from an economic sense, labor is simply, it's similar to buying a machine that you have to pay in order to work. I am more freedom minded when it comes to the way that unions and businesses interact. So I don't think it's right for businesses to be able to engage in horrible anti-union activities. And I think that Amazon, you could certainly make the argument for it, although that's more of an antitrust issue to me than it is a union issue. But I believe that companies and unions ought to be more free to define their own relationship according to what contractual obligations they deem necessary, and less of the government intruding and saying these are things that are necessary.
Just for a short final statement here, companies are really their own power systems. The amount of employees that these huge conglomerates employ that are all around the world, you'd be surprised to see how big KFC is in Japan, for example. It really is astounding. These companies have more GDP than some nations. And I mean, we need to realize that it needs to be controlled in some way, because if it's not, then they can easily just take over the populace through economic domination, which I mean they do in a sense. These are just tyrannies that are controlled by the government, and without any regulation. Like, of course, I'm sure we agree some regulation is needed in some aspects, like saying preventing anti-union meetings. But it's on the spectrum of regulation that's needed, and I think there's a lot more needed. With CEOs making, as I said, more than 900% wage growth compared to the 12% wage growth of workers. I mean, that's just obviously insane to me. Unions are the best way to increase wages, other than government enforced wage law. And I also care about freedom, but I care about the freedom of the majority rather than the minority, which is the elite class. I really care about the freedom of the majority of people, which is expressed through democratic participation. And the reason these CEOs don't want democratic participation is because, of course, it would reduce their own power. And we have to realize all of this is political. Many of the right to work states are typically Republican states. Unions typically vote Democrat because, believe it or not, the Democratic Party used to be believed as the party of the workers, the Workers' Party, back in the times of FDR and LBJ, back in the good old days. We actually had politicians that would pass legislation. But it is political. Reducing the power of unions actually reduces voter turnout of the impoverished people involved in unions. It really is political. It's all political at the end of the day, sadly. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these right to work states had a partisan incentive rather than any ideological freedom incentive for these things. So at the end of the day, this podcast is to reduce partisanship and actually think about the pros and cons of each law and each theme or ideas we talk about. And I hope the audience comes out better informed about these and more curious to research it themselves. So I want to say thank you to everybody that was listening. Hopefully everybody learned something, or something we said sparked some curiosity. Please review us on iTunes. You can email us at policywar@gmail.com if you want us to do any specific ideas or topics that you want us to cover, or any question you have to ask us, just email us there. And I think we will sign out here. Thank you again.